Imagine being left at the altar with nothing but a text message, and then just minutes later making the most unthinkable decision of your life, marrying a complete stranger. Yes, that's exactly what happened to Madison, a successful architect, betrayed just days before her wedding, who chose not to fall apart, but to shock everyone by showing up at the altar, arm in arm with a man no one had ever seen before. A man with no clear past, no proper suit, and no explanation at all. But what she didn't know was that this stranger was hiding more than just a complicated story. He was hiding a fortune, a secret, and maybe the love she'd been searching for all along. Get ready for a story full of twists, unlikely connections, and a truth that will explode at the most unexpected moment. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? If this story grips you, moves you, or surprises you, don't leave without hitting subscribe. That way, you won't miss a single story like this one, and tap the like button. It truly helps the channel grow and bring you even more unforgettable tales. The flowers on the altar still gave off a sweet scent, a sharp contrast to the bitter taste in Madison's mouth. Her veil rested on her shoulders like a broken promise, and the white dress, once chosen with so much care, now felt like a cruel reminder of what would never be. The church was too quiet, the kind of silence that stings, that accuses. There was no wedding march, no groom in sight, just curious stares, hushed whispers, and shame spreading through her like a fever. 4 days earlier, she had received a blunt message from Nathan. "We're going in different directions, I'm sorry." That was it. No call, no explanation, just the sound of her world crashing down in a few cold words. Madison Taylor, an award-winning architect and daughter of one of New York's most prominent families, was alone. Alone at the altar. Alone in front of a crowd that seemed to be waiting for her to fall apart, but she didn't. She took a deep breath, felt the lump rising in her throat, and looked around with a new light in her eyes, a light filled with pain, anger, and resolve. When she walked to the back of the church and whispered something to Olivia, her best friend and maid of honor, no one understood. And they understood even less when she returned minutes later. With a complete stranger by her side, wavy hair, stubbled beard, simple clothes, faded jeans, a worn blue linen shirt, and a gaze that was steady, deep, almost unreadable. His name was Ethan Walker, a stranger to everyone there, including her. But at that moment, Madison took his hand with confidence and climbed the altar steps once more. The priest hesitated. The guests froze. Time itself seemed to stop. "It's all right," Madison said calmly, looking the priest in the eye. "I want to marry this man." Olivia, pale as candlelight in a breeze, nodded from the back of the church. She knew Madison was hurting, but she also knew the look her friend had when she was about to take back control of her life, no matter what it cost. The priest swallowed hard. The guests exchanged looks, some shocked, others intrigued. And Madison's heart was racing, but she didn't back down. "Ethan Walker," the priest asked softly, "do you take Madison Taylor as your lawful wife?" There was a moment of thick silence. Ethan looked into her eyes. There was no love, at least not yet, but there was something just as powerful, respect, and maybe the start of something deeper. "I do," he said. And then the unexpected happened. The moment their vows were sealed with a hesitant, gentle kiss, the world around them fell silent. And as the bells began to ring outside, as if fate itself were laughing, Madison had no idea that this moment would only be the beginning of something far greater, something neither she nor Ethan was ready for. Her phone buzzed just once, a single notification. It was a dull gray Tuesday, the sky hanging heavy over Manhattan like a lazy curtain. Madison was walking out of a meeting at the architecture studio when she heard the muffled sound from her purse. She was still smiling, thrilled by the approval of a multi-million-dollar project. She still believed everything was in its place, and then that message: "We're going in different directions, I'm sorry." That was it. No greeting, no explanation, not even a proper ending, just a breaking point. And from that moment on, everything fell apart in slow motion. She read it, then read it again, and again. For a moment, she thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe Nathan sent it to the wrong person. Maybe he was under some kind of stress, or maybe he was just coward enough to end a 2-year engagement through a text. Madison felt her throat go dry, like she had swallowed sand. Her hands began to shake. The phone slipped through her fingers and landed on the cold marble floor of the lobby. Outside, the traffic continued its usual chaos. Honking horns, hurried footsteps, voices everywhere. It all felt distant. The only thing Madison could hear clearly was the sound of her own heart breaking, slowly, like glass cracking under pressure. Nathan Carter, the man she thought she knew, a doctor, calm, polite, well put together, always with the right words. But deep down, maybe he'd always been this way, someone who'd rather disappear than face things head-on. And Madison, in her rush to build the perfect life, had ignored the signs, the small delays, the excuses dressed up as work, the hollow smiles in their last few photos together. Now it all made sense. She walked to a wooden bench outside the building and sat down, unsure whether to cry, scream, or simply shut the world out for a while. The pain didn't come in the form of immediate tears. It came as numbness, a hollow ache that started in her stomach and pulsed through her chest. Days before the wedding, the invitations had been sent. The vendors paid, the dress was ready, the vows were handwritten, and it all fell apart with a 6-word sentence. That same night, Charlotte Taylor called 16 times. William Taylor showed up at her apartment, determined to fix this like adults, but Madison turned them all away. For the first time in a long time, she didn't want anyone fixing anything for her. There was no quick fix for that kind of pain. All she could do was feel it. She locked herself in for 2 whole days, didn't eat, didn't answer the phone, didn't turn on the lights. The city outside kept moving, but inside her, time had stopped. On the 3rd day, something shifted, not because of a miracle, but because of exhaustion. Madison looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, swollen eyes, messy hair, a soul in pieces, and in the reflection of someone she barely recognized, she made a quiet decision. If the world was going to watch her fall apart, it might as well watch her rise again. With that thought in mind, she put on a coat, grabbed the first scarf she found, and walked down the stairs. No destination. Just a simple need, to find a place where she could finally breathe. It was late afternoon when Madison's feet led her to a small cafe, tucked away on a nearly invisible Brooklyn corner. The front was simple: exposed brick, a chalkboard with smudged letters reading "Coffee of the Day, Hope," and a record player softly playing Ella Fitzgerald, as if it were still 1957. There was something timeless about the place, like time didn't pass there the way it did outside. And that's exactly what she needed, a break. From time, from pain, from the world. She walked in quietly, chose the table furthest in the back, and sank into a worn leather armchair. She ordered a chamomile tea, not because she liked it, but because it said stay calm without needing words. And she stayed there, just watching the city through the fogged-up window. That's when she saw him. 2 tables away near the window sat a man. Simple clothes, an old cap resting beside, his cup unshaven, with a thick notebook open in front of him. He was sketching something, completely focused. So focused he didn't notice the way Madison watched him. Curious, slightly intrigued. She couldn't explain why, but there was something about him, something that held her gaze. He wasn't traditionally handsome, but he carried a quiet dignity, a way of being that made it seem like he had lived through too many stories and had no rush to tell any of them. The waiter passed by and commented casually, "He comes here almost every day. Doesn't say much. But he draws like nobody." "Hells?" Madison nodded, her eyes still fixed on him. Maybe it was exhaustion, or the warmth of the tea, or the way this stranger seemed so detached from the noise of the world. But something nudged her to stand up and walk over. "Excuse me," she said, unsure what she was even planning to say. He looked up slowly. His gaze was steady, direct, but not harsh. Just calm curiosity. "Hi. Sorry to bother you. It's just..." She laughed nervously. "You look so at peace. I'm trying to remember what that feels like. He watched her for a moment that somehow felt longer than it should have. Then he made a simple gesture, pointing to the chair across from him. Sit. Sometimes remembering is easier when you share the silence. She did. And for the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe without drowning. They didn't talk much. A few words about tea, about the streets of New York, about architecture and sketching, without names, without stories. She didn't say she'd been left at the altar. He didn't mention he sometimes slept in shelters, and maybe that's why the conversation felt so easy. When she got up to leave, he simply said, "Come back anytime. I'm always around." She didn't know it yet, but that afternoon was the turning point. Because sometimes life doesn't change with a bang, but with a quiet invitation to share a table. 3 days later, Madison returned to the cafe. This time, not by chance, but because she couldn't get Ethan out of her mind. There was something about him she didn't fully understand, but also didn't want to avoid. Maybe it was the way he never judged her, or the fact that with him she didn't have to pretend to be okay. He listened as if every word mattered, yet never pushed for more than she was ready to give. She arrived early, chose the same table, ordered the same tea. When Ethan walked in as if he were part of the furniture, she was already waiting with a shy smile. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said, placing his sketchbook on the table. "I wasn't sure I would either," she replied, honesty in her eyes. They talked for a while, more openly this time. He shared that he still drew out of habit, even if he had nowhere to use the designs. Said he had once worked in engineering but now lived a quieter life. She talked about her design studio, her demanding parents, the image she always had to uphold. And then, without realizing it, they were laughing about a joke involving broken elevators in luxury buildings, and in the middle of one of those laughs, the absurd slipped out. "I need a husband," she blurted out, almost as if tossing the idea into the air. Ethan furrowed his brow, confused. "What?" "Just for a little while, just pretend," she rushed to explain, already embarrassed. "There's a charity gala my family's hosting, and everyone expects me to show up. Married. I can't walk in alone after what happened, especially with the press watching." He stared at her, serious. He didn't seem like someone who played around with emotions, but he also didn't walk away from the conversation. "Why me?" "Because you saw me at my worst, and you didn't walk away. Because with you I feel safe, and honestly, I think you'd handle it better than most people I know." There was silence. She knew she sounded desperate, and she was, but not out of pride and out of survival. Her reputation, her contracts, her family, everything could collapse with one more public scandal. "I don't have much to offer," she said. "I can pay you something symbolic, a place to stay, nothing intimate, just your presence." Ethan rested his elbows on the table, tilted his head slightly, his eyes impossible to read. "A fake marriage," he said slowly, like he was tasting the idea. She nodded, not blinking. "What if it makes things worse?" Madison held his gaze for several long seconds before answering. "I'm already broken. Ethan, I just want someone beside me until the pain stops." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked out the window, where the wind was rustling the leaves of a lonely tree on the sidewalk. And in that silence, everything quietly began to change. The courthouse was tucked away on a quiet street in Soho, between an antique shop and a rundown thrift store. It was the kind of place most people wouldn't even notice, and that was exactly what Madison needed. No flowers, no speeches, no carefully dressed groomsmen. Just a signature, just an agreement, just a silent performance to calm the storm brewing outside. They arrived early. Ethan wore the same faded blue shirt, freshly ironed this time. Madison wore a simple cream dress, her hair pulled back in a low bun, light makeup just enough to hide the dark circles that sleepless nights had left behind. Olivia was their only witness, friend, confidant, and quiet co-conspirator. She held the paperwork with cold hands and a heart caught between worry and unconditional support. "You can still walk away," Olivia whispered, looking her friend in the eye while they waited for the judge to sign. "This isn't about giving up," Madison replied. "It's about not letting him take anything else from me." Ethan stood quietly beside them, listening without interrupting. He had that gift of being present without pressing, of giving space without leaving. It was like he took up less room than he physically did. And somehow that comforted her more than she wanted to admit. The judge appeared, an older man with a tired voice, and began reading the civil agreement like it was just another file on his long list for the day. And in a way, it was. To the world, this was a formality, but to Madison, it was a beginning. A strange one, yes, but a beginning nonetheless. "Ethan Walker, do you accept Madison Taylor as your lawful wife under the terms stated here?" "I do," he said without hesitation. "Madison Taylor, do you accept Ethan Walker as your lawful husband under the terms stated here?" She nodded. "I do." The pens moved across the paper. The ink was still drying when the judge declared, "You are now legally married." Madison wasn't sure if what she felt was relief or fear. Maybe both. Olivia handed her the sealed envelope with the official documents, and the three of them walked out without drawing any attention. No celebration. No pictures. Just a quiet exchange of glances between the newlyweds and a tightness in their chests that none of them knew how to name. Out on the sidewalk, the wind carried the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. Ethan looked at her with a slight smile. "Want a coffee?" he asked. "I thought this wasn't a real wedding," she teased. "It's not," he replied. "But even fake weddings deserve a coffee after the ceremony." She laughed, and really laughed with her eyes, for the first time in days, and without realizing it, her arm brushed against his. Just a brief touch, a small gesture. But it carried a quiet promise that maybe, just maybe, pretending wouldn't stay so simple for much longer. The silence in the apartment felt louder than any big city noise. Madison turned the key in the door and pushed it open with her shoulder, just like she did every night. But tonight, something was different. Maybe it was Ethan right behind her, carrying a worn-out backpack that looked far too light to hold an entire life. Or maybe it was the fact that, for the first time, she was opening the door, not just for herself. The apartment mirrored her world. Clean lines, minimalist decor, neutral tones. Elegant, modern, meticulously curated. Everything in its place, everything under control, at least on the surface. "It's a lot bigger than I expected," Ethan said, a mix of irony and genuine admiration in his voice. Madison let out a soft laugh. "Pick any room you like, just not mine." He nodded, unbothered. He never seemed offended, actually. Always open, as if he understood more than he let on. She led him to the guest room, a double bed with white sheets, an empty closet, and a wide window with a view of the skyline. "This okay for you?" she asked, already opening the closet doors like she needed to keep her hands busy. "Better than most places I've stayed in." She didn't ask what he meant by that. Not yet. But some part of her tucked the comment away for later. Once the basics were settled, they moved to the kitchen. Madison made an omelette with whatever she found in the fridge and shared it with him. At the marble counter, they ate in silence, chewing not just the food, but the weight of their recent decisions. "You don't strike me as someone who runs from commitment," he said suddenly. "And you don't strike me as someone who'd agree to a marriage of convenience," she replied. "Then maybe we're both walking disguises," he murmured. A pause followed. One of those pauses that says more than any conversation ever could. After that, only the sound of cutlery against plates and slow sips of tea filled the room. When night finally settled in, Madison went to her room and locked the door. She lay down but didn't sleep. Her thoughts wandered, to the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, to the way he folded his napkin after dinner, to those steady eyes that never seemed to judge her. In the room next door, Ethan stared at the ceiling, hands clasped behind his head. The bed was comfortable, but something inside him stirred. Not regret, but something he couldn't quite name. Two strangers. Two broken stories, a contract and a roof shared, and one detail no one had planned for. The quiet act of living together had the power to awaken everything they had promised to ignore. The entrance to the ballroom was a show on its own. Glowing columns, crystal chandeliers, violins playing softly in the background, and flashes from the press firing in every direction. It was the night of the Taylor Gala, the most anticipated, charity event in Madison's social circle, and she knew every eye would be on her, including her parents. Madison stepped out of the car in a navy blue satin dress that hugged her curves with elegance. Her hair was pulled back in a low bun, and simple earrings completed a look that screamed sophistication, even though inside she was a quiet storm. Ethan got out beside her. Dark suit, neatly tied tie, hair combed with more care than usual. He walked calmly, as if the world of champagne toasts and fake smiles didn't faze him, but Madison noticed it, the tension in his shoulders, and she wasn't sure if she felt relieved or nervous to have him there. As soon as they walked in, the room seemed to split into two timelines, the soft music in the background and the whispers that started immediately. Who is he? That's not Nathan. Is this real? The couple crossed the room with synchronized steps, like they'd practiced in front of a mirror more than once, until they reached the family table. Charlotte Taylor, flawless in an emerald green gown, stared at them as if seeing a mirage. William, Madison's father, took a few extra seconds to lift his eyes from his glass of whiskey. When he did, his eyebrows rose sharply. "Madison," her mother whispered, unable to hide the tension. "This is Ethan," Madison said, steady. "My husband." Silence. Charlotte tried to smile, but the tightness in her jaw betrayed the effort. William cleared his throat, and Olivia, always the voice of reason, gently touched Madison's shoulder in quiet support. "You got married?" "When?" Charlotte asked, her voice straining to remain publicly composed. "This week. Without telling us?" "We needed something small, intimate." "Real," Madison answered, holding her mother's gaze. Ethan had been silent until that moment, but when the first glass of champagne reached the table, he spoke. "Meeting Madison's family has been a fascinating experience. She's always spoken of all of you with great respect." The words were neutral, but the tone carried just the right mix of elegance and firmness. Charlotte said nothing, but William seemed to take a longer, deeper look at him. As the night unfolded with rehearsed smiles and polite toasts, Madison noticed something. Ethan wasn't invisible. On the contrary, his presence was felt. He listened attentively, spoke clearly, and more than anything, didn't seem intimidated by anyone in that room. And for the first time, Madison felt something close to pride. She didn't know in that moment that the gala still had surprises in store, but her mother's frozen expression said it all. This was far from over. The gala ballroom buzzed with calculated conversations, mechanical toasts and the carefully practiced steps of those who knew how to move among the powerful. But that night, there was one element that didn't fit the script, and everyone felt it: Ethan. With calm posture and a sharp gaze, he moved through the room as if he belonged there, even though he clearly didn't. While the men discussed stock markets and Aspen vacations, he listened, and when he spoke, it wasn't to impress her, it was to say something meaningful. A thoughtful comment on the night's sustainability initiative, a clever observation about the design of the art installation in the hall. Madison watched from a distance. It was like seeing Ethan under a different light. That evening, he wasn't the mysterious man from the cafe or the quiet tenant in the guest room. He was someone with presence, with command, and more than anything, with something she couldn't quite name, but that made her breathe differently. But the moment was cut short when Nathan appeared. As if fate had waited for the exact second, everything seemed almost balanced, just to twist the knife. He walked in with his usual self-assurance, a woman with large eyes and a polished smile on his arm. When he spotted Madison, Nathan hesitated, just for a second, but enough for her to notice. Then he composed himself and walked over, as if this were just another casual evening. "Madison," he said, smiling like nothing had ever happened. "You look stunning." She stood her ground. "Nathan." He glanced at Ethan. "And this is my husband," Ethan answered, extending his hand before Madison could speak. The handshake was brief, tense, two worlds colliding. Nathan didn't back down. "Interesting," he said with a dry chuckle. "Never heard of you." Ethan gave a small smile. "Not everything worth knowing is on the front page." Nathan narrowed his eyes as if searching for a weakness. "And what do you do, Ethan?" Before Madison could step in, Ethan answered casually, "Nowadays, I try to live with less rush, but now and then I sketch some ideas. Architecture fascinates me." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Oh really, do you actually know anything about it?" That's when Ethan did something no one expected. He grabbed a napkin from the table, lightly sketched the outline of a mixed structure foundation, and explained, in precise technical terms, how it solved a common issue in dense urban developments: silence. Madison, who spoke that language, fluently didn't move. Nathan, visibly thrown off, muttered something and walked away. Once they were alone, Madison looked at Ethan with a mix of surprise and curiosity. Where did that come from? He simply shrugged, grabbing another canapé from the tray beside them. "Let's just say I've had a more formal life before." That moment didn't just reveal Ethan to the room. It revealed a hidden side of him to Madison too. And for the first time, she truly wondered, who exactly was the man she had married? The morning after the gala, Madison woke earlier than usual. Sunlight crept into the apartment through the white curtains, casting a soft, hesitant glow. Still in her pajamas, she walked to the kitchen, brewed a strong cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. The only sound in the house was the gentle bubbling of boiling water, but something kept replaying in her mind, Ethan's words. The sketch on the napkin, the confidence with which he explained a structural system that even seasoned architects often struggled to articulate so clearly. That wasn't luck or a guess. It was knowledge. She tried to brush it off, tried to tell herself maybe he was just well-read, maybe self-taught, but her intuition said otherwise, and Madison never ignored her intuition. Still holding the warm mug in her hands, she walked down the hallway. The guest room door was slightly open. She knocked twice. "Ethan?" No answer. She pushed gently. The room was empty. Bed made, window open, and the faint smell of coffee coming from deeper inside the apartment. He was in the study. Madison stopped at the doorway and watched quietly, unnoticed. Ethan was sitting at the desk, hunched over a black notebook, completely focused on what he was doing. It wasn't casual sketching. It was a full project, and a complex one. She recognized the style of the lines, the way he marked thermal zones, the notes about sustainable materials. This wasn't an amateur. This was someone who spoke her language, maybe even more fluently than she did. "Do you do this often?" she asked, stepping softly into the room. Ethan turned, surprised but not uncomfortable. "Do what?" "Create full architectural designs before breakfast." He smiled, closing the notebook slowly. "Old habits. Can I see?" There was a moment of hesitation, but he handed her the notebook without a word. Madison sat down and began flipping through the pages. As she turned each one, her jaw tightened. This was brilliant. Innovative solutions for solar energy use, grey water reuse systems, hybrid structures focused on sustainability and cost efficiency. "Ethan, this isn't the work of just anyone. Do you realize the level of this?" "I do." "Then why didn't you say anything?" He crossed his arms and looked at her, serious. "Because people see what they want to see, and I wanted to know what you saw as when you looked at me." She closed the notebook gently. Her heart was beating faster, not just from surprise, but because in that moment she realized she was diving into something far deeper than she expected. "Ethan, who are you really?" He gave a half smile as he stood up. "That's a question you'll have to answer for yourself." And then he walked out of the room, leaving Madison alone with a notebook full of clues and a new feeling slowly taking root inside her. Madison couldn't sleep anymore. Ethan's notebook rested on the desk, but it felt like it filled the entire apartment. Every line, every technical note, every comment on environmental impact, all of it screamed a truth he was trying to hide. And now she refused to ignore it. Over the following days, she started paying closer attention. The words he used, his precise vocabulary, the way he commented on newspaper articles, how he spotted structural flaws in buildings just by walking past them. And most of all, the way he carefully avoided direct questions about his past. She could have hired a private investigator. could have run a basic online search with the tiniest piece of information, but Madison didn't want to discover it on her own. She wanted him to tell her. She wanted him to trust her, to tell the truth, by choice, not pressure. And the truth came on a Tuesday night, as soft rain tapped against the living room windows. "Ethan," she began, sitting across from him on the couch, "I need to know." He looked up from the book he was reading. There was no shock in his eyes, just a heavy silence, like the conversation had been scheduled long ago. "Know what? Who you really are." He closed the book slowly, rested his elbows on his knees, fingers interlaced, took a deep breath, and finally, he answered, "Ethan Walker is my real name. But what you don't know is that I am, or was, the founder of Walker Tech." Madison froze. "The environmental solutions company. That's the one. I started it at 29 with 2 partners. We began in a garage. It grew too fast. I sold my share 3 years ago." She leaned back on the couch, trying to absorb it. "Why?" He looked away. His jaw tightened. "One of my partners wanted to close a deal with a construction group that was clearing protected forest. I refused. They called me naive, said I was holding them back, so I walked away. I chose my conscience over my fortune." "But you're still wealthy, aren't you? Enough not to depend on anyone. But also, enough to hide if I want to." There was silence between them, one of those silences that hurt more than any words. "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked at her, completely sincere. "Because I was tired of being seen as a number, a dollar sign, an investment profile. I wanted to know if someone would see me, without the labels, without the pedigree, just for who I am. And me. You looked at me like no one else ever has, Madison. But I also lied by omission, and I understand if that changes everything." She wanted to respond, wanted to yell, wanted to say she felt betrayed, deceived. But beneath it all was something stronger than anger, the sense that he was telling the truth. All of it. She stood up, eyes glassy. "I need time." And she left the room before he could reach her. Ethan remained on the couch, unmoving, staring at the door as it closed. He knew he'd given up control. Now, all he could do was wait, and hope she'd choose to come back. Vermont smelled like damp earth and fresh bread in the oven. It was the kind of place where people still smiled at strangers on the street, and time seemed to stretch out lazily, unbothered by urgency. The decision to visit her grandmother had come from Madison, a sudden impulse she couldn't fully explain. Maybe she needed fresh air. Maybe she just wanted distance from the emotional mess her life in Manhattan had become. Or maybe, deep down, she still wasn't ready to be away from Ethan. "She's particular," Madison warned with a half smile, driving down a narrow road lined with maple trees. "But she'll like you, at least until she finds out we're married." Ethan gave a quiet chuckle. "Perfect. I'll brace myself for the interrogation." Her grandmother's house sat atop a gentle hill, surrounded by a rustic garden and a porch that seemed to wrap around the entire home. As they stepped out of the car, they were met by Mrs. Ruth, white hair pulled into a tight bun, sharp eyes, and a cane that hit the ground with more authority than most words. "So, this is the husband," she blurted, wasting no time as she eyed Ethan from head to toe. "That's him," Madison replied, lips pressed together to keep from laughing. Ethan simply smiled, reaching out a hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Ruth. Let's see if it stays that way after dinner," she said, walking ahead without waiting for a reply. That evening, they sat around an old wooden table covered with a linen cloth and simple dishes filled with heart and flavor. Ruth asked pointed questions, and Ethan answered with a calm elegance that gradually melted even the most suspicious glances. Madison watched with quiet amazement. He wasn't putting on a show, he wasn't pretending, he was simply himself, calm, present, kind. And slowly, it became clear that Ruth didn't just tolerate him, she was starting to like him. "You know, young man," Ruth said after dinner, as they sipped tea on the porch, "you've got something most big city men have lost. You listen, and when you speak, you're not trying to prove anything." Ethan just nodded respectfully. Madison, meanwhile, felt something shift inside her. Her heart warmed with the little things, The way he carried the grocery bags without being asked, how he held her coat when the wind picked up, the quiet care he took cleaning the dishes when no one was looking. What had started as forced coexistence was softening into something else, something gentler, more intimate. There were no declarations, no promises, but there was a comfortable silence between them. A kind of quiet understanding that only grows when two souls start to truly meet. That night in the old wooden house's guest room, Madison caught herself smiling alone. For the first time in a long while, the emptiness felt less deep, and Ethan, lying on the spring mattress in the room next door, was smiling too, without knowing she was doing the same. Night was slowly falling over Vermont, painting the sky in shades of lavender and gold. On the porch of her grandmother's house, the world felt slower, softer. The cool air brushed against their faces like a forgotten caress, and the distant sound of crickets was the only soundtrack to that rare pause between two hearts quietly colliding. Madison sat on the wooden steps with a glass of wine in her hands, wrapped in one of her grandmother's old shawls. Ethan was beside her, also silent, simply watching the sky shift colors. They had spent the day together, talking with Ruth, walking through the woods, exchanging smiles that came effortlessly. But now something hung in the air, something unspoken, something heavy yet light at the same time. "You know what's strange?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. "What?" "That sometimes, with you, it feels like I've lived all this before. Like I've known you in another life. Or in a dream. I almost forgot." Ethan gave a small smile, still looking at the horizon. "And how does that dream end?" She let out a short laugh, but her eyes were full. "I don't know, but I think it starts right now." He turned toward her. Ethan's gaze held no rush, no doubt. It was as if he'd been waiting his whole life for that exact moment. Madison felt her stomach tighten, not from fear, but from certainty. The kind of certainty that comes when you find shelter, where you never thought to look. Neither of them said another word. He simply reached out, slowly, and touched her face with the tips of his fingers. And when their lips finally met, there was no hurry, no urgency. Just a kiss, slow, deep, filled with everything that had been trapped in the silences between them. It was a kiss that said, "I see you." That said, "I'm here." That said more than any sentence ever could. When they pulled away, Madison kept her eyes closed for a few seconds, as if trying to hold the moment in her chest. Ethan rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "This complicates everything." "Doesn't it?" She smiled, eyes still closed. "This changes everything." That night they slept under the same roof in separate rooms. But with hearts closer than they had ever been, there were no declarations, no labels. All they needed was that moment, that kiss, and the silent promise it carried. Because what had just begun wasn't part of the contract. It had no paper, no terms, no expiration date. It was real, and maybe for the first time they were both ready to feel it. It was supposed to be just another dinner, one of those family gatherings where business, charities, and international travel were discussed with the same ease as choosing a bottle of wine. But from the moment she woke up that day, Madison felt an uneasiness in her chest, as if something unseen was about to break, and she had learned not to ignore those feelings. Charlotte Taylor had been unusually cordial in the days leading up to it, the kind of quiet before the storm she knew too well. And that evening she was flawless, a scarlet dress, a pearl necklace inherited from her mother, and that calculating gaze she only wore when she already knew something no one else did. Ethan arrived a few minutes later with Madison, both trying to act naturally, but the tightness of their intertwined hands betrayed the tension behind their smiles. Dinner was served with refinement, beautifully plated courses, discreet waiters, soft background music. Everything was perfectly elegant, until Charlotte raised her glass of red wine with a smile just a little too sweet. "Ethan, how lovely of you to join us. We were just talking about your background." "So inspiring." He nodded politely. "I'm flattered. Madison told me you prefer to stay low-key. And of course we respect that. But in our world, well, very little stays hidden for long." The room seemed to grow colder. William, silent until then, stared at his plate. "Mother." Madison began to intervene, but Charlotte raised her hand, still smiling. "I just wanted to share an interesting little discovery. I asked a friend to look into something. Just as a precaution, of course." She reached for a black folder resting beside her chair. From it, she pulled out a few printed pages. Ethan Walker, founder of Walker Tech, developer of revolutionary water reuse systems, awarded by Green Engineering Forums, retired from public life after a humiliating business dispute, according to some sources. She placed the documents gently on the table, like she was serving dessert. Silence fell like lead. Madison looked at Ethan, her heart racing, not because of what was revealed, but because of how it was revealed. He said nothing at first. He just took a slow breath and looked Charlotte in the eye, with a calm that bordered on defiance. "It's true," he said finally. "All of it." Charlotte raised her eyebrows. "And why hide it?" "Because I wanted to see what it was like to be seen without labels, without numbers, without advantages." William finally spoke, his voice low and grave. "What else are you hiding?" Madison stood up, feeling the pressure rise in her chest. "That's enough. This isn't a courtroom." But Charlotte didn't back down. "It's a family dinner, darling, and families don't live on secrets." The knife cutting through the chicken on the plate felt like a sharp metaphor, and that night, the lie unraveled. The truth stepped out of the shadows, and everyone at that table realized that marriage, once just an agreement, was becoming something much more complicated and far more dangerous for those trying to control it. The night felt darker than usual as Madison slammed the apartment door shut. The city lights flickered through the windows, but inside her everything was shadow. The public revelation still echoed in her mind like a constant siren. She couldn't shake the sound of her mother's triumphant tone, the heavy silence from William, and most of all to Ethan's expression. Not one of guilt, but of someone who'd long accepted rejection as something natural, and that hurt more than any lie. He walked in a few minutes later, slowly, as if asking permission to exist, in that space. He didn't say anything right away. He just took off his coat, placed his keys on the counter, and watched her from a distance. Madison stood with her back to him, hands resting on the sink, trying to breathe through waves of anger, sadness, and confusion. "You could have told me," she said finally, without turning around. "It didn't have to be that day or at that table, but before, any day, any place." "I know." She turned to face him, her eyes glassy but steady. "I felt like a fool, Ethan. The only person at that table who didn't know who I was married to." He stepped into the middle of the room and stopped, keeping space between them. He didn't want to invade or offer a cheap excuse. "I lied, out of fear, out of self-defense, because I liked being seen by you as just a regular man. Someone who could sit with you in a cafe and not be noticed, not be calculated, not be used. And you thought I'd do that? Use you?" "No," he said softly. "But I thought that if you knew who I was, maybe you never would have looked at me twice in that cafe." She shook her head, biting her lip. "You don't trust me." "I didn't trust anyone. Until you." Silence. Madison walked over to the couch and sat down, hugging her knees. What hurt most wasn't the secret. It was that she had started to love someone who still chose to keep parts of himself hidden. "I need time, Ethan," she whispered. "I don't know what any of this means. I just know it hurts." He moved closer slowly, sat down in the armchair across from her, but he didn't reach out. He just looked at her, with a kind of quiet sadness she hadn't seen in him before. "I understand. Do you regret it? All of this?" He paused for a moment. "I regret lying, but never meeting you." She looked away, not because she didn't believe him, but because believing made everything harder. That night they slept in separate rooms again, for the first time, not out of convenience, but out of need. Two wounded hearts divided by a late truth and by feelings that now felt terrifyingly real. 2 weeks passed without a single word between them. Ethan had left the apartment the morning after that painful conversation. There was no fight, no promises, just a short note left on the kitchen counter. "I'm giving you space, but I'm still here if you need me." and Madison, even hurt, knew he'd done the right thing. They both needed air, time, silence. She returned to her work routine on autopilot. Meetings, projects, presentations. Everything happened, but without color, without flavor. Because no matter how hard she tried, Madison couldn't pretend that nothing had changed. A heart doesn't go back to the same place after it's truly been touched. Then, on a Friday afternoon, Olivia showed up with a curious invitation. "There's a new cafe in Brooklyn. I've been told you need to see it." "A cafe? Right. Now?" "Trust me." Madison went. She wasn't sure why. Maybe out of longing, maybe out of stubbornness, maybe out of hope. When she stepped out of the car, her eyes took a few seconds to make sense of what they were seeing. It was the same cafe where everything had started, but now completely transformed. The new sign read, "Root Cafe." The exposed brick walls had been restored, still holding their original charm. There were hanging plants, solar panels on the roof, and a small display of framed technical drawings along one side wall. One of them, she recognized. It was the design Ethan had sketched for her on a napkin that very first night. Madison walked in, her heart racing. The smell of cinnamon and fresh coffee wrapped around her senses, and then at the center of the room, as if time had come full circle, there he was, Ethan. In dark jeans, a rolled-up gray shirt, and that quiet smile, the one she had learned to love. "Hi," he said, as if the days apart had lasted only minutes. "What is all this?" she asked, looking around, eyes already misty. "A gift, or maybe an apology made of bricks and beams. I bought the cafe, renovated it using your sketches. Ours. I wanted to build something that was ours from the beginning, even when we didn't know it was the beginning." She blinked, trying to process it all. "This is real." "It is. As real as everything I didn't know how to say before. I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I just want you to know I'm here, no masks, no secrets, just me." Madison took a step forward, then another, until she was close enough to see the light in his eyes. "You saved the place where we first met. Because it's also the place where I found myself." She hugged him, without another word. A long, quiet hug that melted away hurt, fear, and doubt. And in that silent embrace, the answer was born. An answer neither of them could speak, but that both their hearts understood perfectly. Rebuilding is never as simple as starting over. Starting over means leaving the past behind. Rebuilding means facing the ruins and deciding, day after day, what's worth keeping and what needs to be changed. That's exactly what Madison and Ethan began to do. There were no grand declarations, no rushed promises, just quiet agreements born from small gestures. He'd swing by her studio to walk her home. She'd show up at the cafe with cinnamon cookies, just because she knew he liked them. Little by little, the spaces once filled with hurt began to make room for something more solid, more grown up. "I want to show you something," Ethan said one afternoon, as he closed the doors of Root Cafe earlier than usual. He took her upstairs, where he had turned the mezzanine into a cozy loft with a view of the street. In the corner sat a wooden drafting table. On it, 2 open projects. "This one," he said, pointing, "is yours, the one you showed me at the beginning, about urban renewal in abandoned spaces." She stepped closer, gently touching the paper. "And this one?" she asked, turning to the other. "This one's ours, a hybrid. Your vision, my technical work. I was thinking, maybe we could present it together at the Sustainable Architecture Conference next month." Madison was quiet for a few seconds. It wasn't just a professional proposal. It was an invitation to share a dream, to stop walking alone. "I'd love to," she said, with a smile that started in her eyes. After that, the days passed at a gentler pace. They started sharing more than just tasks and projects. They shared silences, memories, and scars. One evening, while going through old boxes in the apartment, Madison found the wedding vows she had written for the ceremony that never happened. She hesitated, but read them to him. Ethan listened in silence, his eyes fixed on hers as if every word still carried weight. And when she finished, He stepped closer and took her hands. "I may not have been the man you described in those vows," he said softly, "but I want to be, a little more each day." She embraced him, feeling that this time the bond was real. There was no contract, no urgency, no escape, just two wounded hearts choosing to stay despite everything. Rebuilding, after all, wasn't about erasing what had happened. It was about turning pain into foundation and truth into something to build on. The sun rose slowly over the open field, painting the sky in gentle strokes of orange, pink, and gold. The trees swayed, softly, as if blessing the warm breeze of that special morning. There was no church, no red carpet, just a stone path lined with lavender and genuine smiles. It was their wedding day, but this time, it was real. A year had passed since Ethan and Madison signed that civil contract, filled with clauses and boundaries. Back then, they promised not to fall in love, not to get involved, promises broken before the first few days had even ended. Now here they were, surrounded by close friends, Olivia smiling through tears, and Ruth sitting in the front row with her hands gently folded in her lap. Madison wore a simple, light dress without sparkles, yet she looked exactly as she was. A whole woman, choosing to love with full awareness. Her hair was softly pinned back, her makeup delicate. Everything about her radiated authenticity. Ethan wore a dark blue suit without a tie, his shirt slightly open at the collar. His beard was neatly trimmed, his eyes fixed on her as if the world had disappeared. There was no officiant, just Olivia, who had been legally authorized to conduct the ceremony, and who, between laughter and tears, led it as a true bridge between the past and the present. "When we met," Madison said, holding Ethan's hands, "I didn't know your name or your past, but there was something in you that made me want to stay. Even when everything in me was telling me to run." Ethan smiled, eyes misty. "When I agreed to that fake marriage," he replied, "I didn't know I was saying yes to the best part of my life." Their vows were spoken with the calm of those who've lived through chaos, with the certainty of those who've survived doubt, with the quiet strength of those who choose, not because they have to, but because they want to. When Olivia pronounced them husband and wife, there were no fireworks, no orchestra, but there was a kiss so full of truth that the silence around them filled with meaning. And really, that's all they had ever needed. The celebration took place in a makeshift garden next to the cafe. Lights strung between the trees, soft music, lovingly prepared food, and long embraces. Ruth danced with Ethan. William, discreetly emotional, toasted his daughter. And even Charlotte, with a glass of champagne in hand, showed something close to a genuine smile. That night, no one talked about contracts or appearances, only about unlikely meetings, second chances, and the rare kind of love that's born when no one else believes. But two hearts insist on trying. They didn't promise perfection, they promised presence, and they kept that promise. One day, at a time. A few months after the wedding, Madison woke up each day with a new kind of purpose. It wasn't just about love. It was about the project taking shape beneath her fingers and coming to life in the real world. Alongside Ethan, she had founded Studio Rays, a space that blended architecture and sustainable technology with soul, purpose, and real impact. The cafe where everything had started now served as the studio's headquarters. Upstairs, drafting, tables, samples of eco-friendly materials, computers glowing with prototypes, and plants hanging on the walls. Downstairs, coffee was still served, along with smiles and chance encounters, as a living reminder that great stories often begin in the most unlikely places. "This is the social housing project using repurposed shipping containers," Madison explained to a group of investors, pointing to the models. "Functional design, affordable costs, and zero waste." She spoke with a spark in her eyes, not to impress, but because she truly believed in what she was doing. And now, finally, she was doing it her way. Ethan, in turn, had rediscovered the joy of creating without pressure, of designing for purpose, not profit. He handled the technical side of the projects, implementing smart energy solutions, adapting cutting-edge technology to fit the real lives of everyday people. "And to think all this started with a napkin," he joked, watching one of their projects get approved by a local city council. Together, they traveled to conferences, gave talks, and won awards. But what made them proudest was the direct impact. Families living in homes they had designed. Schools renovated with recycled materials. Entire neighborhoods coming back to life. More than that, Madison had discovered a new version of herself. Lighter, stronger, whole. She was no longer Charlotte Taylor's daughter. No longer just an elite New York architect. She was a woman who had rebuilt her own story and now helped others do the same, brick by brick. Her partnership with Ethan had grown too. Through projects and sleepless nights, they had learned how to disagree without drifting apart, to compromise without losing themselves, and most of all, to celebrate every win together, even the small ones. In the living room of the apartment they now called home, a wall was filled with frames that told their story, a photo from the fake wedding, the original napkin sketch. In a shadow box, the key to Route Cafe, and an aerial image of the first housing project they had built. "It's not just about architecture or business," Madison said one night, lying on the couch with her head in Ethan's lap. "It's about making the world look more like the life we want to live." Ethan gently ran his fingers through her hair, and we're just getting started. Because when two people truly find each other, not for status or appearances, but for who they really are, they don't just change, they build. And Madison and Ethan were only on the first floor of everything they still dreamed of creating. On the porch of their new home, surrounded by the soft glow of hanging lights, Madison and Ethan watched another day come to an end. In the distance, the city still pulsed, but here, the world seemed to slow down. She stood barefoot on the warm wood of the deck. He held a cup of tea in his hands, savoring time itself. There was no more rushing, no fear, no masks. Their love wasn't made of fireworks or grand declarations. It was built on consistency, on care, on real presence. It was the note left on the counter, the coffee at just the right temperature, the hand reaching out in silence, the gaze that said, "I understand," before the pain was ever spoken. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" Ethan asked, smiling with quiet tenderness. "Never," Madison replied. "And yet, part of me always knew." He looked at her, curious. Knew what? That the love of my life wouldn't come in a perfect package. He'd come as someone imperfect, but willing to be real with me. Ethan pulled her closer, wrapping an arm gently around her waist. "And you always saw more than what I showed. Because even when you were hiding," she said softly, "I could still feel you. Silence, but the kind that holds you." A gentle breeze lifted strands of Madison's hair, and Ethan tucked them back behind her ear, as if handling something sacred. She rested her head on his shoulder, and they stayed like that, simply being. Time was no longer the enemy. It had become an ally, a reminder that everything, even love, has its own rhythm. Inside, their wedding album sat on the coffee table. Next to it, the first sketches of the sustainable home they planned to build in the countryside, a space to live, to grow, to dream, and maybe to plant even deeper roots. Because true love doesn't demand, it's built, with listening, with choosing, with intention. And Madison and Ethan had chosen, day after day, to stay, even when everything seemed to say otherwise, even when pride, fear, or the past tried to sabotage them. They stayed, not because it was easy, but because it was real. Now sitting beneath the slowly falling night sky, they knew their story wasn't a fairy tale. It was something better. It was real. And everything real comes with imperfections. But also with deep roots, beautiful scars, and a rare kind of light that only time can reveal. Life didn't stop after happily ever after. It kept moving, as it always does, with good days and not so good ones, with projects that succeeded and others that had to be rebuilt from scratch, with nights spent wrapped in each other's arms, and others spent arguing about trivial things, like where the keys were or what time dinner should be, but their love for it only grew quieter and deeper. Madison walked across the construction site of a public school under renovation. It was one of Studio Rise's most ambitious projects, transforming an abandoned building into a modern, sustainable, and welcoming space for children in vulnerable situations. Ethan followed close behind, tablet in one hand, clipboard tucked under his arm. The green roof still needs a few adjustments, he noted, but we've already optimized rainwater harvesting by 22%, she smiled. And to think all of this started with a napkin sketch in some rundown cafe. With you in a wrinkled dress and eyes that wanted to escape the world, he added, winking. They laughed together. That was their essence. Two survivors of their own pain, two builders of something larger than themselves. Not just homes or structures, but future, possibility, legacy. At the end of the day, as they watched the sun set from a bench in a still unfinished park, Ethan gently took Madison's hand and held it in silence. Neither of them spoke about children or grand plans. They just stayed there, in the now. Because they had learned that the future isn't built only on goals. It's built on moments like, "This, you know what I realized?" she asked, her face turned toward the orange sky. "What?" "That I wouldn't change anything, not the pain, not the silences, not the doubts." He turned to her with tenderness. "Not even the fake marriage contract." "Especially that," she replied. "Because it was the strangest road to the truest place." Ethan kissed her forehead, a simple gesture full of meaning. In that kiss lived the quiet promise of tomorrow. Not a perfect tomorrow, but a shared one. A real one. They knew life would still bring challenges, that they would love each other in different ways as the years passed, that there would be loss, missteps, and new beginnings. But they also knew, deep down, that what they had built was too strong to be shaken by uncertainty. Because loving, in the end, isn't about finding someone who's ready. It's about choosing every day to grow beside someone who makes you want to be better. And Madison and Ethan? They chose to build. They chose to stay. They chose to love in the most beautiful, most difficult, and most honest way there is, the kind that continues, even after the curtains fall. Now tell me, how many times has life pushed you into something that seemed crazy, but deep down it was exactly what you needed? How many times have you judged someone by their appearance, only to discover the real value hidden beneath? Madison. And Ethan's story is about just that. About not closing your eyes to the unexpected. About listening to your heart, even when logic is screaming. And most of all, about giving a second chance, not to someone else, but to yourself. Because sometimes, the love of your life doesn't show up with flowers and a perfect smile. He shows up as a stranger, with a worn-out backpack and a gaze that sees right through you. And what about you? Have you ever experienced an unlikely love? Have you ever had to rebuild trust with someone else or with yourself? Have you ever been surprised by a feeling when you least expected it? Share in the comments where you're listening from. If this story touched you, hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and send it to someone you care about. Oh, and don't forget to like the video. It really helps the channel grow and bring more stories like this one.